God blesses every one of these patriarchs using their weaknesses to teach them and help them grow in spiritual knowledge. And that is an encouragement because we know that God's power works best in our weakness.
This is Mission 66, an adventure through God's Word. This program is brought to you by TWR in partnership with the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Luis Sayao. We're currently in the book of Genesis. You can follow along with your downloadable study guide at mission66.org. Your teacher, John Matthews, and his co-host, Esther Sisulu, begin our study.
Welcome to our Bible study, a chapter at a time with some guidance from our Bible expert and teacher, John Matthews. Well, as you know, in this world, there are people that only think about money and profit. They're not afraid to take advantage of their workers if they think that it will help them get richer. Well, this is what we see as it pertains to Jacob's uncle Laban in Genesis chapter 30. But no matter how Laban tried to cheat Jacob and change the deal on him, God made Jacob prosper anyway. And today, John Matthews will present the theme, Honesty is the Best Investment.
Esther, thank you so much. Great to be with you again and with you all listening for this latest edition of Mission 66, where we are studying the life of the Jewish patriarch Jacob. And here we have in this episode the one who had cheated, now being cheated. Jacob had cheated his brother Esau out of his birthright and his paternal blessing, and he was running away from the wrath of his brother, who was pretty annoyed, to put it mildly. And he was hoping to start this new life among his family's relatives, coming to his uncle Laban. And there, he's attracted to Laban's daughter, Rachel, and he wants to marry her. But what Laban does is something pretty crafty. He does a switch. So instead of giving Jacob Rachel, he gives him the other daughter, Leah. And it was all done pretty much in a dimly lit place, even in the dark. So Jacob didn't even realize that he'd been tricked until the next morning. Now, Jacob, as you can imagine, is very angry about what has happened, but there wasn't an awful lot that he could actually do about it. And so he eventually winds up agreeing to work an additional 7 years if he can also have Rachel. That was why we called our last episode in chapter 29, Double Trouble. So Jacob now has 2 wives to support, and it's meant that he's ended up working for Laban for a total of 14 years. But through it all, we see how God's promises to Abraham are going to be fulfilled from generation to generation. Come what may, come human mistake after mistake. And so Jacob is a 3rd generation patriarch, and he'll certainly do his part in increasing the number of descendants. Remember, children were considered to be a great blessing from God. They were a sign of prosperity. And in the last chapter, we saw that Leah, well, she was well able to have babies, but Rachel, well, she was finding it more difficult. And as we get to Genesis 30, we find that Rachel's really having a tough time over this. So let's read it. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. And she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And then she said, "Here is my servant Bilhah. Go in to her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went in to her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. And Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a second son. And then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. Now, where have we seen that before? Well, it's very resonant and similar, isn't it, to what happened with Abraham and Sarah. When Sarah couldn't bear children, she gives her servant girl to Abraham to have children through her. Evidently, this was the way that things were done then, and now, 2 generations later, Rachel is following that same practice, even though this was not God's original idea. And then we get to verse 9, and we now see Leah doing the same thing, and it became almost a race to see which of these two could bear the most children. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went out, and he found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. Now, mandrakes were a fruit. They were considered to enhance sexual performance and increase the likelihood of conception. And so Rachel says to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel replied, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. You see here this underlying animosity that exists between these 2 wives of Jacob, almost a bargaining contest to see who could produce the most babies. And when Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived, and she bore Jacob a 5th son. And Leah said, God has given me my wages, because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a 6th son. And then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. And afterwards she bore a daughter, and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. And we're going to find out more about Joseph as we continue making our way through Genesis. And now Jacob begins thinking the time is right for him to leave Laban's employment. This is verse 25. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go. For you know the service that I have given you. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it. And Jacob said to him, you yourself know how I have served you, and how your livestock has fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? And he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob replied, you shall not give me anything. if you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come to look into my wages with you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. And Laban said, Good, let it be as you have said. So Jacob is prepared to stay on with Laban if Laban agrees to let God be the one who decides who would prosper. And he chooses to receive as payment the colour of sheep and goats that were statistically least likely to be born. And this deal clearly is beneficial to Laban. So at this point, Jacob is prepared to show Laban that honesty is the best investment. But watch what happens in verse 35. But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. So Laban tries to keep Jacob from having greater profit by keeping the spotted animals from him. It was Laban's sneaky way, you see, to try to make sure he got the most livestock. But Jacob, well, he's got his own ideas, and he tries a method that may have been common, but for which we have no good explanation. Here it is, described starting at verse 37. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees, and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. And he set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and all the black in the front of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they may breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys.
This is Mission 66, where we're studying Genesis chapter 30. And I'm Esther, and we're going to take some time now to engage in some back and forth with our teacher, John Matthews, on what we've just read in this chapter. Now, John, considering the pages of this chapter, it shows us that there were a lot of superstitions that was involved in the daily life of the people at the time. For instance, we see Jacob putting the sticks in the water troughs, and we also see the instance of the mandrakes. Now, why do you think this was? What was this about?
Yeah, well, do you know what, Esther? We've looked into this and just can't find the reason behind this particular method that Jacob used, or indeed how it worked. But the fact that Jacob did it means that he believed that it would make a difference. But frankly, I have to believe that it was God who made Jacob's flocks increase, not any mysterious custom. And God had promised to bless him. And boy, that's exactly what he's doing. And he now has a huge family and indeed large flocks of animals as well.
Do you think it was the same with the mandrakes that the sisters were trading? Perhaps they thought that they'd be able to enhance their chances of fertility.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And, in every culture, people believe in not only aphrodisiacs, but also in medicinal plants that would cause a woman to be more fertile. And these particular mandrakes were these plants that were believed to help generate children. Now, the Bible only reveals to us that this practice existed. There's no detailed explanation on how it all worked in a scientific sense, or indeed what the plants may have been used for. And part of our human failing sometimes is the attitude that we can bring results about by our own human effort or understanding. And we want to be able to wave a magic wand and make things go our way. Both Leah and Rachel, there's no doubt they believed that these plants had the power to provide fertility and change the course of their future. But we will see that God is the real source of any blessing, not human efforts.
Well, just to bring it into our context, right? Considering what you said, could that possibly include like taking medicine when we're sick?
Well, medicine is one thing. I mean, what we're talking about here seems to be superstition, which is quite another. And of course, the going to a doctor when we're unwell is common and wise. When we're sick or in pain, we naturally want relief, and there are medicines that help that, and common sense will often tell us what we need to do. But ultimately, the best place to go, without doubt, by a mile, is to our loving Heavenly Father in prayer, because He will give us guidance. He understands why we're going through what we're going through when we can never understand. And so He will give us guidance. He will give us divine comfort. And when you've experienced something of God's divine comfort, you know that there is nothing like it. And He'll even bring us, in certain circumstances, healing. And so science has revealed much information to us, but science is not God. And it's far from knowing everything. And God does know everything.
John, let's have a look at verse 27, because Laban here says that he's learned of some things through divination, which I think we could classify as some kind of metaphysical science. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, in this case, Esther, we don't know for a fact whether Laban was telling the truth or not. He deceived Jacob so many times, and so he could be trying to deceive him here by making Jacob think that he had access to some supernatural power in order to gain some kind of advantage. But at the same time, it is possible that Laban did play around with divination. He lived in Mesopotamia, where there was plenty of occultism ongoing. And in the next chapter, in fact, we're also going to learn that Laban kept household idols. Rachel actually stole her father's idols when they moved out. So Laban clearly dabbles with divination, possibly other pagan practices as well. But God is showing us that He's called Abraham and his descendants out of paganism in order to build the patriarchal lineage, which ends up in the story of redemption through Jesus. Meanwhile, God blesses each and every one of these patriarchs, and He uses their mistakes even and their weaknesses to teach them and make them grow in spiritual knowledge. And boy, is that an encouragement, Esther, because we know that God's power works best in our weakness. Isn't that counterintuitive? And that, though, is what He wants for each one of us, is that God is never more able to show His power in our lives than when we are weak.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Such a good truth. John, throughout this process, right, looking at Jacob's life, we're seeing that he's prospering more and more. And as time goes by, we see sons are being born into his household, and of course, there are a whole lot of mothers that are included in this story as well. But what does this all mean for Rachel? What's her relevance in relation to the 12 tribes of Israel that are being formed? Because, she told Jacob, she said to him, "Give me children or I die." And then we see she had Joseph. And then after this, she gave birth to Benjamin. And then she actually did die. So what's Rachel's relevance here? Because she seems to just disappear from the story after that happened.
Yeah, you're right, Esther. And Rachel seems almost forgotten, even though she was the first choice of Jacob. But in the divine providence of God, she's only allowed to have 2 of the 12 sons of Jacob. But Rachel is fundamental in this story because a lot of space in Genesis will be devoted to the account of Joseph, who was sold as a slave in Egypt by his own brothers, who were the sons of, shall we say, those other mothers. And because of this, Jacob's whole family, because of Joseph, that's Rachel's daughter, and because of this, Jacob's entire family would be kept alive from famine because of Joseph, Rachel's son. And they'd also discover that Joseph had risen all the way to second in command of Egypt. From Joseph, 2 tribes would come, Manasseh and Ephraim. But let's review the sons of Jacob who became the 12 tribes. So from Leah, we have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and 1 daughter called Dinah. From Rachel came Joseph and Benjamin. From Leah's handmaid came Gad and Asher, and from Rachel's handmaid came Dan and Naphtali. Well, what became of these boys? Well, Reuben, the firstborn, he lost his birthright when he slept with his father's concubine. Simeon and Levi led a retaliatory strike against some Shemites who raped their sister Dinah. Now, their violence was condemned, and Simeon was eventually assimilated into the tribe of Judah. Levi became the tribe of priests, and Joseph rose to prominence over them all. Now, Judah is credited with convincing his brothers not to kill Joseph after he'd been kidnapped. Now, Naphtali and Dan are less known, but not obscure. Naphtali followed Gideon in his deliverance raid on the Midianites. That's in Judges 7. Whilst Dan, he's not mentioned in the roll call of the 144,000 sealed in Revelation. Gad and Asher and Issachar and Zebulun, they're less prominent, whilst Joseph and Benjamin will figure greatly when we get to the account of the Exodus from Egypt.
Whoa, well, that was a fascinating look at the family tree, if you will, of Jacob. It's absolutely exciting knowing that we're going to get to the accounts of these brothers. So, John, thank you for that. Let's move on now to the final summary of Genesis chapter 30.
Yeah, let's do that, Esther. And our theme today has been honesty is the best investment. And what we see here is that prosperity and blessings come from God, but not through human effort or dishonest means. Jacob prospers not because of his own strength or because of the tricks that he knew, but because of God's immense generosity. And finally, when Jacob does prosper, he used all kinds of schemes and superstitions of the time, but none of it worked. In fact, it was God who was the one blessing Jacob the entire time and guaranteeing that what he'd promised Jacob would actually come true. God was the one who birthed the spotted sheep and goats. God's blessing overtook Jacob even though he was being cheated. And you know, God is able to bless us, you and I, today, any time that there's a Laban in our life who may be cheating us. So let's remember then, in finishing this episode, Proverbs 3 verse 5, which says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths."
Well, it is on that encouraging note that we thank you, as always, dear friend, for being with us for our Mission 66 program. We'll be back again as usual next time as we continue studying through the book of Genesis, focusing on chapter 31. So until then, from myself and John Matthews, goodbye and God bless you.
That wraps up today's episode of Mission 66 with John Matthews and Esther Sisulu. Follow their daily teaching by downloading your free study guide at mission66.org. Go deeper into God's Word and discover how each day's teaching can apply to your life. Download your free study guide at mission66.org and have it for our next program. That's also where you can leave a comment or make a donation to continue Mission 66 here and around the world. That's mission66.org. Mission 66 is a ministry of Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.